All right, 9.3, completing the square. Completing the square sometimes is one of the harder ones for students to grasp because it's just got some extra, I know the steps look maybe a little bit different than what we're used to, but once you get the hang of it, it's really not that bad. All right, so let's kind of look at one. All right, on this section, they're going to be pretty straightforward. There we go. The next section is a little more in depth. So if I have x squared plus 10x, all it wants me to do is to complete the factor, or complete and factor the square. All right, I've got 3 steps. Step 1 is to find half of the linear coefficient. We talked earlier that the standard form of a quadratic is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. This is my quadratic term, this is my linear term, this is my constant term. Notice I don't have a constant term in this one, I only have the quadratic term and the linear term. Well, that's okay because I'm going to take half of the linear coefficient. So here my linear coefficient is 10. All right, so I'm going to take, if this was ax squared plus bx, I'm taking half of my b. Taking 1/2 of whatever my b is. In this case, it's 10. So I'm going to take 1/2 of 10, which equals 5. Right? Half of 10 is 5. If it was an odd number, a 9, I would just have 9/2. I would leave it as a fraction. I'm going to take half of b, that's the first step. Step 2 is to square that result. So I'm going to square the result. In this case, I'm going to square that, and I'm going to get 5 squared equals 25. All right, so every time whenever it says to complete the square root, what needs to pop in my head as soon as I hear those, I need to be thinking 1/2 b squared. That's kind of the key. Every time I take half of b, I square it, I add it. Step 3, add the square from step 2 to the quadratic. There's my quadratic, x squared plus 10x, and I'm going to add the square from step 2, plus 25. All right. The nice part about when I complete the square, every single time, the result is going to be a PST. So long as a PST, it's a perfect square trinomial. How do I know it's a perfect square trinomial? Because it's a trinomial, right? 3 terms. The first term is a perfect square. The last term is a perfect square, and my signs line up. My b term is, if I took the square root of the first term and the second term, so I got 5, and I double it, I get my middle term, and that's going to work every time because I created this. The way I created it was by taking half of this, which means every time I add a half to a half, I'm going to come back to this, and I squared it. So I know it's always going to work out. Every time I complete the square, we'll talk about this more in the next section, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but 100% of the time whenever I do this, I know it's going to factor into whatever this variable is, whatever this sign is, plus or minus, the half of b. And it's going to be quantity squared. All right, so it would have been the same thing as x plus 5 times x plus 5. Every time, whenever I do a perfect, or when I complete the square, I'm going to get a perfect square trinomial. And we did extensive factoring of perfect square trinomials in like 7.1 or 7.2. And every time that I recognized it was a PST, I always factored it as a quantity, a binomial squared, and it was always x plus the square root of whatever my c term was. All right, so we'll look at another one. Let's do one that's odd. X squared plus 5x. Step 1 is to find half the linear coefficient, which is 5. So I'm going to get 1/2 times 5, which equals 5/2. Step 2 is to square that. When I square it, I'm gonna get 25/4. Step 3 is to add that from step to the quadratic. So add the square from step 2 to the quadratic. X squared plus 5x plus 25/4. All right. Every time that will factor into x plus, in this case, these are both pluses, the half of b. All right, I'm done. Every time. It will always be a PST, and it will always factor into x plus or minus, depending on what the sign is, the half of b. All right. Again, we'll talk about that a little more in depth on the next one. All right. That should get you going pretty well. They may give you a little different look on your B term, but the steps are always going to be find half of that linear coefficient, square it, add it to the quadratic, and it will give you a PST, and it will always factor like that. Don't make these harder than they are.